But I mean, obviously Jesus did not die from these thorns, but it must have been very painful, because as they were scraping against his skull, and would have lost a lot of blood from this. And they didn't just place it on him; they thrust it on his head really hard. And then verse 18, and they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And verse 19, again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. So, this Jesus had just been scourged. His spine is exposed, and now they thrust the crown of thorns on his head, and they're mocking him. And they placed a reed or a staff in his hand, and the staff they gave him, they're smacking him on the head with it very violently over and over again. And just like he just had the thorns like shoved on his head, and then they're just smacking him on the head with it. Like, it's just but they did this to mock him. Moving on, I'd like to, if the beginning of 21. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place of Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Verse 24, and they crucified him. Before Jesus was even crucified, he had to carry his crossbeam. And because he was so weakened by the scourging, which his back had just been laid open, his spine is exposed, he fell 3 times carrying this. And also, because he just had a crown of thorns shoved on his head, he would have been in a most likely a state of delirium because of that. And that probably didn't help in this process. But one interesting thing that Mark notes is that they offered him wine and myrrh mixed together as a way to dull the agony. But Jesus refused. And why does Jesus refuse? He was fully resolved to drink the cup of suffering that the Father had assigned to him. And there they crucified him. To start, according to many early historic writers, crucifixion was, according to many historic early writers, suicide was preferable to crucifixion. I mean, this death was only reserved for the vilest of offenders, the most serious of criminals. And the Romans perfected it. They were experts at crucifixion. And they would use 5 to 9 inch long nails to pierce the victim. And first would come the hands. And they laid Jesus down, and they would drive the nails into a very specific point in the wrist. There's a hole right here. That's where they would drive the wrist. I don't know the name of it. I tried to find it, but Josephus, who was an early Jewish writer, writes that crucifixion is the most wretched of all deaths. And this is just a testament to the fact that Jesus did not receive their offering of pain relief. Is a testament of how determined he was. He slammed the hammer on the nail in his wrist. Very, very extreme pain would shoot through the nerves in his wrist to register in his brain and back again to his wrist. This was complete agony. The Romans would nail the victim to the crossbeam, and lift them up into the notch of the upright post. And then the feet came next. Either pierced through the metatarsals, which is most commonly the center of the foot, between the bones in your feet, or through the heel bone, which is based on the remains of Johanan, son of Hakal, was hanging there. He could hardly breathe. Because you're in that position, there's no comfortable position on the cross. Jesus would have to push up through the nails lodged in his feet to be able to breathe. And then because of the agony of the pain of the nails in his wrists, he could not hang in that position any longer and would sink back down the hanging position. And he would repeat this over and over and over again. And just to think that Jesus, who had just been scourged, he was torn to shreds and his spine was exposed, would be grating against the upright post every time he pushed up to breathe and sink back down into the hanging position. This happened for hours, over and over again, repeated, and for some victims, possibly days. Bones would pop out of joint, being extended to great lengths, starting with the wrists, following the elbows and the shoulders. The arms would eventually be stretched out by these bones out of joint by about 9 inches longer in arm length. And as all this is happening, Jesus is getting more and more weakened, and because of this, the process of asphyxiation begins. And just know that the crucifixion is never intended to kill, but that how you would most commonly die from crucifixion would be that a victim would eventually drown to death by the fluid in their lungs or by dehydration. And Jesus just wasn't, as the movies portray, he wasn't crucified with a loincloth about his waist. He was crucified naked, publicly before the multitude before him, bearing the shame and reproach and scorn of the cross. And it was always a public spectacle of an event. And it was used as a statement by the Romans to the passerbys by saying, hey, don't mess with us, or this could be you. You see this guy right here who's been torn to shreds and is nailed to a cross. This could be you. So don't mess with us. Obey. But Jesus endured this torture for hours until everything had been accomplished, as he came to do. He came, he saw, and he conquered. And even the strongest of men would fear crucifixion. But yet, Christ our God would become obedient. Joining. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. Verse 5, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, and being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So crucifixion in the Greek is called stato, which means to crucify, to mortify, to deaden, to make a sacrifice of. And with this suffering that Jesus endured, Christ has fulfilled what he spoke to his disciples at the Last Supper, his body and blood given as the all-sufficient sacrifice, meaning that's it. This is once and for all. No more sacrifices needed. He's inaugurating the new covenant, fulfilling all scripture, saving the lost. But all this he endured would be for nothing if he had not risen from death.